My name is Henry Foster Drummond, 82 years old, a former district manager for an electrical supplies distribution network that no longer even exists today. 3 children, a 3-year widowerhood that weighs like a concrete beam in the center of my chest, and a silence inside the house that I can no longer distinguish from the silence that exists within me. I put the shirts in the washing machine because it was the only reason I could invent to leave the house that dawn. It wasn't about the clothes. It was about not being able to stand those 4 walls of the apartment in the Primrose Hill neighborhood anymore, which for decades had been synonymous with stability, and which now seemed to tighten with each passing hour. I sat on a hard plastic bench and watched the drum spin, and it was in that circular, repeated, aimless movement that I saw myself. I spent 50 years building a very clear identity in my head. I was the man who didn't make mistakes. Or rather, I was the man who, when he did make a mistake, always had a good reason for it. I worked more than 60 hours a week for decades. I provided a roof, private school, vacation trips, paid college for all 3. I believed, with all the conviction a man can have, that providing was the same as loving, that protecting was the same as being present, that correcting was the same as caring. My eldest daughter is Claudia. She is 56 years old, lives in Crawley, and calls me on special occasions with a punctuality that, if I were honest, seems more like obligation than desire. My middle son is David, 53 years old, an architect, lives right here in London, but he might as well be on another continent for all I see him. And the youngest is Ronald, 49 years old, who moved away to Edinburgh right after finishing college and built a life as far from mine as he could. For years I blamed the 3 of them for this estrangement. I told myself they were too busy, that their generation was different, that they didn't have the same sense of family that I had learned from my father. But on that cold July morning, with the steam from the machines lightly warming the chilly London air, I stopped lying to myself. It was me. I was the one who built the wall. Brick by brick, year by year, decision by decision. And now I was trapped behind it, no longer knowing what my own daughter's voice sounded like when she truly laughed, not knowing what David dreamed of building besides buildings, and having no idea what Ronald did on his Sunday afternoons. The clarity began to appear more strongly 7 years ago, on my 75th birthday. Martha, my wife, had organized a dinner at the restaurant we frequented since the children were small. A place in Soho with that smell of garlic and red wine that always made me feel lighter. All 3 came, their wives, their husbands, their grandchildren. It looked perfect on the outside, but in the middle of the conversation, David mentioned that he was considering turning down a big project because he wanted more time with his children. And I, as I had always done my whole life, didn't hesitate. I said that was a mistake, that opportunity doesn't knock twice, that responsibility comes before comfort. I spoke with the conviction of someone who always believed he was right. I didn't even wait for him to finish explaining his reasoning. David didn't shout. He didn't confront me. He just lowered his eyes to his plate, let out a deep sigh, and said with a calm that was more painful than any argument, "Thank you, Dad. I had forgotten that you have all the answers. The silence that followed those words was the heaviest silence I had ever carried. There was no anger in my son's voice. There was weariness, an old weariness accumulated over decades of a father who always arrived at the conclusion before hearing the question. In that instant, for the first time, I realized that my children didn't want my wisdom. They wanted my presence, and I never knew how to offer that. When Martha left, 2 years after that dinner, the little that still united us finally crumbled. She was the bridge. She was the one who transformed my coldness into something that seemed like care, who took my silence and wrapped it in gentle words to deliver to our children. Without her, all that remained was an old man holding a phone that almost never rang. For 3 years I lived in that silence. I woke up early with nowhere to go. I had coffee alone, looking out the window at the street below. I watched the news without paying attention. I went to bed early because the night was too long. And a feeling grew within me, a feeling I refused to name for a long time. But on that early morning in the laundry room, I finally named it: loneliness. A loneliness that I myself planted, watered with pride, and harvested with open arms without realizing what I was carrying. I sat there watching my old shirts spin in the machine, these shirts that Martha used to choose for me during end-of-year sales. And suddenly I realized I was crying. Without drama, without sobbing, just a thread of tears running down the face of an old man in an empty laundry room at 2 a.m. And that tear, more than anything I had felt in recent years, seemed honest. It was there that I made a decision. If there was still any chance to save what remained of my relationship with my 3 children, I would need to be the first to climb the wall I had erected myself. And the first step was the most difficult of all: to apologize without putting any but in the middle. My whole life, my apologies had been accompanied by justifications. Sorry I missed your game, but I had to work. Sorry I was harsh, but you needed to learn. I finally understood that an apology with "but" at the end is not an apology. It's an argument wrapped as a gift. I picked up my cell phone and looked for David's name in my contacts list. I paused, the kind of pause you make when you know that on the other end of the line there might be a closed door. But I dialed. And when he answered with a cautious voice, the voice of someone who has learned to prepare for what their father will say, I took a deep breath and spoke without rehearsal, without defense, without the slightest trace of authority. David, I'm so sorry for not having been present. I'm so sorry for making you feel that you were never enough. There's no excuse for it. The silence that came this time was different. It was a silence that breathed. David was silent for a few seconds. It felt longer than any conversation we had ever had. And then he said, in a voice I hadn't heard in a long time, a voice that still had something of a boy in it, Dad, I need to think. I hung up the phone and sat in the laundry room until the clothes dried, my heart beating differently, not relieved, not happy, but somehow more whole than I had been in years. That week I did something I have never done in my life. I consulted a psychologist. Dr. Felicity, in her 40s, with an office in a townhouse on Baker Street in London, received me with a calm that disarmed me from the start. I was never one to talk about feelings. In my generation, men carried things alone and moved on. But I sat in that chair, looked at that woman I didn't know, and broke down more than I had broken down in decades. I told her about Martha, about my children, about 5 decades of an identity built on the foundation of absolute reason. She listened to me to the end, without interrupting, without taking any notes. And when I finished, she said a simple thing that stayed within me like a seed. You spent your whole life being strong for others. Perhaps it's time to be vulnerable for yourself. Vulnerable. I spent my whole life treating that word as a synonym for weakness. At the company, vulnerability was for those who weren't prepared. At home, it was something the children could have, but that I needed to compensate for with firmness. Now, at 82, I was discovering that the armor I wore to appear unshakable was precisely what had pushed away everyone I loved. The second step was to let go of the role of teacher. All my life, I believed that if I wasn't teaching, I wasn't being a father. But Claudia, David, and Ronald were already in their 50s. They had already raised their own children, built their own stories, accumulated their own scars. They didn't need guidance. They needed someone to witness who they had become. I called Claudia on a Saturday afternoon. She answered, surprised, because I never called without a specific reason. I asked how she was, truly, without an agenda, without a prepared topic. She began to tell me about a difficulty she was facing at work, about a colleague with whom the relationship had soured. In another time, I would have interrupted in the second sentence to offer a solution, but this time I bit my tongue and stayed quiet. I let her talk until the end, and when she finished, I just said, "That sounds very heavy to carry, my dear." She was silent for a moment and then said, with genuine surprise in her voice, "Yes, Dad, it really is very heavy. Thank you for listening." Thank you for listening. 56 years as a daughter, and it was the first time she had thanked me for that. It broke and healed me at the same time. The third movement was to take initiative without expecting anything in return. My whole life, I waited for them to call out of obligation, to show up on the right dates out of respect for their father. I thought it was the least they owed me for what I had given them. But giving without presence is not love. It's a transaction. And they owed me nothing that I hadn't charged back with interest of coldness and distance. I started sending simple messages, without demands, without guilt. I found an old photograph in a small box Martha kept in the closet, a photo from a trip we took to the Lake District National Park when Ronald was still in high school. The 3 of them in the car, hair blowing in the wind, laughing at a joke I no longer remember. I photographed the picture with my phone and sent it to the group they had put me in years ago, and which I rarely used. I just wrote, "I found this today and remembered how much I enjoyed your company that day. I never said it at the time. I was saying it now." Ronald responded first. He sent a heart emoji, which I stared at for about 2 minutes without really knowing what to feel. But I felt something. David wrote, "What a beautiful photo, Dad." And Claudia put, "I remember it like it was yesterday." 3 small responses. But for a man who had spent 3 years listening to the silence of the apartment, those 3 responses were an entire world. The 4th step was the most frightening, to reveal the man behind the armor. In my entire life, I never showed weakness to my children, even when the company went through difficult times, even when my health gave its first scares, even when Martha and I had crises that almost broke our marriage. I maintained the facade. Dad was fine. Dad had everything under control. Dad knew what he was doing. But one afternoon, when David came to visit me for the first time in a long time, we sat on the apartment balcony drinking tea, and I simply told him the truth. "I'm lonely, son. I'm afraid of the silence in this house. I wake up in the middle of the night and don't quite know what to do with myself." I said these things without drama, but with honesty. David looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It wasn't pity. It was something closer to recognition, as if he was finally seeing the father behind the manager, the man behind the authority. He put his hand on my shoulder and stayed there. He didn't say anything for a while. He just stayed there. And that silence was completely different from all the silences we had lived together. That silence was companionship. The 5th lesson was the hardest to swallow, accepting what can no longer be fixed. There are school plays I never attended because I had meetings. There are times when they needed comfort and I offered advice. There are arguments I ended with the last word when I should have ended with a hug. Those years don't come back. That time no longer exists. And a part of me will carry that forever, not as punishment, but as an honest record of who I was and how I choose to be different now. The 6th exercise, and perhaps what transformed me the most in my daily life, was learning to truly listen. Not listening to respond, not listening to correct, listening to understand. Every week, when I talk to one of my children, I ask questions without any hidden agenda. How are you feeling about all this? What has been bringing you joy lately? What have you been dreaming about? And I stay quiet, and I listen, and I discover that my children are incredible people whom I didn't bother to get to know while I was too busy being the perfect father. Last week, Ronald came from Edinburgh to spend a weekend. He slept in the room that was his during adolescence and that I never changed. We went for a walk along the Thames on a Sunday afternoon, that golden late afternoon light that London has when the day decides to be generous. And he told me about a relationship that had ended, about a pain he had been carrying alone for months. He told this to me, to the father he had always hidden things from because he knew his father would judge. I listened in silence. I didn't say he had made a mistake. I didn't say I told him so. I just said, "How difficult it must have been to go through that alone, son." He stopped walking, looked at me and said, "You've changed, old man." And there was tenderness in that nickname that had never existed before. I've changed. Yes. At 82, I traded certainty for listening, pride for presence, authority for affection. I understood that being right can be a very lonely victory. I spent decades winning arguments and losing intimacy. And I learned, later than I should have, that the most powerful words a father can say are not, "I knew it," but rather, "I am here and I am listening." The laundry drum that July dawn finished spinning, and I carefully folded my old shirts, knowing that the real work began outside those glass doors. And that is the work I have been doing every day since, showing up. Without armor, without certainties, without the manual on how to be the perfect father. Just me, my children, and the time we still have left to build something true with what remains.